Hi.
Hi.
And hi, TDF fans. Thanks for joining us. So I'm David Henry Hwang, and I'm being reunited today with my collaborator, my friend, my inspiration, who's back in New York City, Jeanine Tesori. Hi.
Hi, TDF fans. I'm back with my brother-in-arms, David Henry Hwang. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm back in New York City after I often go on retreats, the euphemism. It's called deadline terror, I like to call it. And I'm back for a little while, and then I'm going to go back out of town because there's, as my friend says, there's nothing like the sound of a deadline as it passes you by.
Yeah, but deadlines are super important.
Deadlines are super important. So I am back. I'm glad to be in the same time zone as David Henry Hwang. I feel like we're always in the spiritual time zone, David.
Yeah, I actually never really feel that you're that far away. But where were you just now?
I was in Southold. And I was always planning to go out there because I'm writing I'm writing I think what's going to be probably the last opera that I'm going to write. And I'm almost done with Act 1. I got so close. And so I'm going to stay out there a little bit longer because there's just not as many things to do except stare at the blank page. So I'll be back in 2 months.
And just why do you think this might be your last opera?
Oh, I know that the libretti that you've written are so successful, and I found that writing, which is to me a lonely enterprise anyway, and I always feel like there is some kind of spiritual pandemic that happens because you have to isolate. And but I find opera particularly difficult. Part of it is because the palette is so, you can use so many things as a composer and you're responsible for the orchestration, but the libretto is just the beginning of so many things. And I feel like there's a lot more onus on the composer. There's a lot more burden on the composer to think, oh, if I do this and this would be this, and then this can be that. And it's sort of, I find it much lonelier. So I just think for my mental health, this is probably going to be the last one.
Yeah. I don't know about the mental health part, but that does make sense. And like my experiences as a librettist, I think of, like if I'm doing it, working on a TV show, then the showrunner is the decider. Yeah. And I think when I work on an opera, the composer is the decider.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like I'm serving the music, and the music moves the story forward.
I think it's a combination, but I feel this way when we work together on musical theater too, that my job is to take the text and make sure that every single person, whether or not it succeeds or not, understands the things that you and I have talked about, like activating things, that it's communicating the language. What is the story? What's happening with the interiors of these characters? And that's the job. But the idea of simultaneity, it's I don't know if you write this, but the idea of who is speaking at once and the kind of counterpoint that just comes from surgically to me looking at something and thinking, oh, I wrote this in one scene and that would be so beautiful if we laid that in here. And it's sort of like making little bathroom tiles with. To me, it's like Scrabble tiles that you put in and you glue in your bathroom and kitchen at the same time with tweezers. That's what it feels like. Not to discourage opera composers out there, please.
Opera composers, people love composing for opera. Some composers, because they come from, particularly when they come from the music world. But anyway, yeah. I think we're supposed to be talking about soft power. So
yes, let's segue.
Let's do that.
Oh, so I'm going to read the question.
I think that would make sense.
Okay.
In this case. Yeah.
I'm going to give it my best line reading. David, you had been working on soft power for a while before Jeanine got involved. Those were bleak days, weren't they, David?
Yes, they were.
Was it to ask her, me, and what convinced me to sign on? So I'm going to hand this to you, as I always like to do.
Okay, so
just make David go first. Like, if we had been in the same family, I'd be like, you try it. You go up. You and I would be at the pool, and I'd be like, "You go to the highest thing, and then I'll go."
We don't really do that with food. Like I can't remember a situation where we were, and you're like, you eat it first. Anyway, so yeah, I had this idea to write sort of a reverse King and I after seeing the most recent Lincoln Center production of King and I, and becoming aware of, this musical that I love also had some kind of troubling things about it, like the premise. So it's basically about, a white woman who goes to Siam and teaches the king how to civilize himself and his country. And it's just interesting to me the degree to which works that we don't necessarily think of as having a political agenda oftentimes do. And in this case, it's, a white supremacist agenda. It's sort of saying that the sort of white culture is superior and can civilize this other culture. So, so I started thinking about this. I first, as I usually do, shared the concept with Lee Silverman, our director. And Lee, I think I'm not telling a tale out of school because she said this in public. At first she was not sure if it was really possible, but we both thought, well, if anyone can figure out how to do this, like how can you put a sincere musical, a sincere Rodgers and Hammerstein type score in a kind of ironic frame and a critiquey frame? And if there's anyone who could do this, it would be Jeanine. So I've said before that the day that that you agreed to come on the project, I have compared rather grandiosely to, Churchill, the day Churchill learned the Americans were going to be entering the war effort, because they felt like, we might be able to win this thing. I was at your office. You can take the story from there.
Yeah, the day that you were at my office and we were talking actually about teaching, I was going to teach at your program. And really, I was very excited to do that. And right before you left, you said, I have this idea. And I remember thinking very specifically that, when I hear an idea that I think is a great idea to be musicalized, it's hard to verbalize because it appears as a color and a feeling. Mm-hmm. If I had to say what the color was, it's golden. And the feeling has a warmth to it. There's this, it's not center of the earth hot, but there is a warmth. And I think that's the thing that you hold on to. I have always related it to the first time you come in an apartment and you think, I could live here. That's the feeling you're going to have every time you go in that apartment. And so I knew it was a great idea, and I knew it was going to be difficult in the way that we were asking people to not come in with a blank slate. We were asking them to use their memory of a piece. A lot of times musicals, my favorite kind of musical is one that people come in and they don't know what they're in for. And so they didn't know what they were in for, but we were asking them to define their experience by a known piece and look at it through a different lens. And there's an assurance of discomfort there. And I also wanted to make sure that what we were doing was not critiquing the artist, but the work itself, because these are two giants in the industry. Rodgers was an unbelievable composer, a very specific composer. And the works that they tackled were complicated and very nuanced and of the time. And there was a lot of courage to them. And now we're asking ourselves to do something in essence with the American Songbook. We're asking the American Songbook to show up in a different way, in a different context. We're indicting it in a certain way, our own history of the theater, which is a reflection of American history itself. And that felt scary. That felt really scary.
I also like to think that we're trying to update and honor the sort of progressive intentions of the piece, because other than, yes, Rogers was a genius composer, and Hammerstein was a very strong progressive, and worked to put those themes into those shows, even when they were, yes, controversial, and sometimes got them banned for you couldn't perform South Pacific in the south of the U.S., for instance. And then, sort of time moves on, and certain concepts which were progressive in one age now become problematic in another. And how do we preserve really the radical impulse of the work itself in a different age?
Yeah, you just said that beautifully. The thing about repertoire, there was a point in time where one didn't do repertoire because it was, when you think about, there wouldn't have been an encores in the 50s because they were creating the things that something like a series of an encore, a golden age musical, if you will, that it's a repertoire that reflects the time that you're in. And so those stand still, but they're recreated as living pieces. So I think that's what's really interesting is, can we create repertoire that's in a different context to show something? And I think that's a real question. Does it mean that we erase certain things because of the time, or do you present a context in which that piece was written? Soft power has evolved. Oh, right. Okay.
I'll read this one.
Okay.
Soft power has evolved a lot over the years. Yeah, a lot. Integrating life-changing events along the way. Have you discussed addressing the issues raised in this pandemic year in the next iteration?
That's a very good question. I don't know that. And David, I would be really interested to see what you think. You and I have certainly, with the team, we've been in constant conversation about it. This year was not surprising to me in the way that I think there is a difference. When I started as a young composer, one of the things that my mentor said was, stop inventing, work to develop. The Bach inventions are based on spinning gold out of one measure. And you look at that one measure, he works and works and works, but he's not adding something in. He's taking a cell and creating an astonishing work with all of these voices by putting it upside down and backwards and all this stuff. It's basically how I cook, which is the kitchen looks like a mess and I've made an egg. And I think that what we've really talked about this year is that we're not surprised politically. I'm surprised at the depth of many things, but we weren't surprised in a way because it's the things that you were actually writing about, the racial violence, this idea of democracy under fire. You were very prescient, is what I would say. If anything, I feel like we've doubled down on what we started out to do and what we started. You're the muscle of this. We're looking to you. And we realize the urgency of the show as opposed to it's a response to the year. I think the response to me is an emotional dedication to the show. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, of course, as you say, we're talking with our team all the time about this sort of post-2020 version of soft power, which we, thanks to supportive producers, have the intention of bringing back to New York and, fingers crossed, to Broadway. What we feel, though, that's been, I think, affected by this year is, number one, that we don't need to spend quite so much time relitigating the 2016 election, and that soft power has always been a show, as the question suggests, which was affected by what was going on while it was being written. Number one, the 2016 election, and number two, the personal event of my being attacked and stabbed in the neck. And one of the things that has happened over the past year, which was is not really new, but has become, it's not really new at all, but has become very highlighted, is the attacks on AAPIs, the spike in anti-Asian hate. And so I've come to sort of refer to myself as an OG anti-AAPI attack survivor, because it happened to me, a few years ago. And we don't need to now sort of convince the public that Asians get attacked, that that I was the victim of a hate attack. In 2019, when we opened it to the public, I think there was, would still be some skepticism among the general audience, not among Asian Americans, but among non-Asians about, oh, well, is there really racism against Asians? Do they suffer hate attacks? One of the silver linings of all the horrible things that have happened this year to APIs and the massacre in Georgia is that the American public at large is much more aware of anti-Asian hate. And there's things like that I think that yes, are events of the past year, but are going to have an impact on how we move forward with this show.
It's a good point. And it makes me, as you're speaking, it makes me think that in a way, like we don't have to explain what The King and I is to almost anyone. Most everyone has seen it. Most everyone knows it. So they enter in with that collective memory, that collective knowledge. They now enter into the theater with an understanding without saying, oh, that would never happen. The attack on the Capitol. There was an attack on the Capitol in the show. You wrote that. And there was always a sense of, God, would anyone ever believe that? That's almost feels satirical. Well, it's not satirical anymore. It happened. So this idea that people come in understanding that the plot of current events and the plot of a show, that you don't have to do any heavy lifting, as you said, you don't have to do the heavy lifting of the reference of The King and I, of the idea that democracy can literally, physically, politically be under attack, and this other idea that this quotidian, unfortunate, this daily acts of hate are now archived. They're now measured. They're counted in a way that I think when you were attacked, there was a debate. Was it a hate crime? Was it not a hate crime? Inside that murkiness, there's no debate anymore.
Yeah, and I think that part of writing the show for me was also to, the debate, was it a hate attack? That was my debate about myself too. Like I wasn't really willing to say that it was, even though at the time that I was stabbed, there's a Queen Assemblyman, Ron Kim, who had a press conference back then to denounce anti-Asian hate. But I wasn't ready to be part of that press conference. And, as we were working on the show, one of the things that was very powerful about you and Lee is that you both really press me all the time to take my stabbing more seriously. Like even now when I say, oh, I'm, an OG API attack.
Right. I have to say,
I know you sort of probably hate it.
I hate it when you do that. I hate it because I understand it. And I think it's part of trauma. I think that you have to work through trauma to make it part of the fabric of oneself and into the memory, and a disassociation almost as a reportage to report it as opposed to really understand it. And I think you are brilliant. And I think you do not enjoy centering yourself, but I do think there's a need to center yourself. And those two forces that go of, I'm going to name a character DHH, but I don't want to be at the center. That to me is the most delicious and also painful to be adjacent to, because when you say that kind of thing, I get into a protective mode. And I think I was pressing in the way that I had to relive some things when I wrote Fun Home and become an actor, someone with agency inside, so I could try to evoke what it was like to be under attack inside your house by someone who was supposed to parent you. And in this way, I think what we were asking, and certainly I was asking, is a very painful ask of saying, what is it really like to be that at the hands of not only what was a mystery and was never solved, but how one incorporates that into memory. How do you process it? How do you evoke those things to make people understand, even if it's not on the page, that we have fully discussed it? And that is a big ask.
And as a result, I did take my stabbing seriously in the show and came to accept that the DHH character was the victim of a hate attack. But it still took some time after that, like subsequently over the past year, for me to start saying, not only was DHH the character attacked, but DHH, me, I was the victim of a hate attack. And particularly after Georgia, like I felt, because I've been like, well, the police didn't say it was a hate attack. And then after Georgia, I realized, oh, wait, they never say anything is a hate attack. So I've only come around, I'd say, in the last 6 months to feeling comfortable saying that I was the victim or the survivor of a hate attack.
That there's a mystery to these things. How do you measure? I know that Jonathan Larson said, how do you measure love? But how do you measure hate? And what's the mystery, and how can you put a label on this was a hate crime? A crime is a hate crime. When one gets assaulted or attacked, it's a hateful act. If you are targeted, that is, as we've seen, then there's a specificity to the hatred, but it's a hate crime. When you assault someone, I think it's a hate crime for me. And so I watching you being at the side, I think was this act of courage. And also it has to be entertaining. And again, those two forces, you as George C. Wolfe always says, you want to bring people in for the pain, you got to have a party. And I think that this idea of a musical, and you and I talk about the delivery system, because I think, agitprop or any kind of theater of war, when you have something in a bouncy C and the text is hateful vitriol, it's very complicated, because your mind is taking in a kind of tuning that's telling you emotionally, evoking joy or happiness or something, and the text is being delivered in a way that's laced with sugar and some evil language. That's very confusing and very powerful, and in the wrong hands, I think it's something that can be misused. Time to be each other's biggest fans. Talk about your favorite project written by the other person. Oh. I love this game.
So you're going to make me go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, yay.
Well, I mean,
I'm going to have a drink.
There are many, many, many things that you have done that I've loved, but a huge, I would say, Seeing M Butterfly for me, really located something that I wanted for myself. I've always seen that envy is a locator. When you're not really taking it and Gore Vidaling it, I think that envy is a wonderful locator about what one aspires to for oneself. And when I saw M Butterfly, I thought, if I could do something like that, I'm gonna really try to stay in theater. It was so perfect. It was nothing that I had ever seen, and it used music in a way that made me feel like I had seen a musical, and I feel like I had been informed and inspired, and I understood something about the writer in such a deep way, and it fired on all the pistons were firing in that theatrical experience. And there are those times. The Garden of Earthly Delights was another one. Angels in America was another one. All of the Balanchine works are another one. The Pulse. Like I can point to these, the Tom Waits musical at BAM. Those are those tent poles that held me up, and so I think it's because it's one of the very first things that I saw that made me feel that way.
Thank you. I don't know what it is. It's very hard to listen to all these nice things that just keep us a straight face. So, gosh, I mean, I guess I'm gonna have to. There's so many things because you've written so many things that are wonderful. But I think I'm gonna go with Fun Home because Fun Home is something. So I think of myself as sort of like I'm very interested in structure and I'm very interested, in form, and the idea that you could take that piece and decide to do it with three different Allisons, and that it does that makes a lot of sense intellectually, but I would go, oh, this is going to be a really, an intellectual puzzle. But I'm not sure, like, well, how's that going to work emotionally? Mm. And being able to take that structure and make it completely an emotional experience for me is sort of a miracle. And you know me well enough as a person now to know that, I'm only like, I'm a little bit pathological that I really am only able to cry in a theater or feel things deeply for the most part. And so just the overwhelming rush of emotion that continue, and it's so beautifully modulated. Like I'm overwhelmed here, and then I have a chance to draw back, and I have a chance to rest, and there's just when I'm ready, for the next, and that is a gift to be able to actualize that in a way that, yes, the story is, the story is wonderful, and the story has a lot of has certain things that are inherently emotional, but how do you put it together in a way that has cumulative impact? And you achieved that. And so that's why I love it even more than other things.
It's so great to hear you talk about it, because we don't really we've referenced our other work to say, oh, I learned this on this and I've learned this, but to hear you talk about it is super gratifying. And one of the things that about Fun Home for me was that it was an end of a chapter. It was an end of a search of some kind, of certainly the way I grew up. And I think a period of innocence in the 70s, the 70s felt like the 50s in a certain way. There were things that were just not part of the national discussion. We were wrapped in silence and just assumed that things were a certain way because we were told, and the media piped that in a certain way. Well, our experience was quite different, most of us, from what was happening at home. And for me, I know from Violet and having the 2 stages of a woman, and then in Shrek using the 3 stages of a woman, was for me, you see the masters' paintings of men and women who are, they do pencil studies when they're preparing for a big work. And I don't think we afford our artists sometimes in musicals what they're after in the long game. To say, okay, that's a super flawed piece. Well, of course it is, and this is, but perhaps I get very irritated when say, oh, you're, the 3 stages of people, that's your thing. It irritates me because it's like, no, don't be so lazy. It's not my thing. My thing is trying to understand who we've been, the nest egg of the human condition, of that like the stages of who we are and who we were, and the coexistence of those things. I find it endlessly fascinating that we are, in a way, a geological event, and we have all of these periods, and they don't go away. Some of them go away, but we are in evoke our memories in a certain form, so that they're in the present moment. And I'm fascinated. So I think it was the end of that search, and I don't think that I would probably be using that in a sense, because it really put a punctuation mark after that question for me.
Have either of you worked on any projects that fell apart that you still think about?
Oh my God, that's a great question.
So, okay, one interesting project that fell apart for me was, but the reason it's interesting is I think it birthed a lot of other things. I was in my late 20s, and a producer came to me and wanted to commission a musical based on Andre Malraux's novel Man's Fate. And for TDF listeners who are not familiar with it, Malraux was essentially writing about the Chinese Revolution, and so he put together, this producer put together this team, and I was going to write the book, and Philip Glass was going to write the score, and Hal Prince was going to direct it, and Eiko Ishioka was going to design it. And it all fell apart because the Malraux estate ultimately wouldn't give the rights to the musical. But then we all ended up, well, I never really worked with Hal Prince, but the rest of us all ended up working together in different ways. The producer was Stuart Ostro, who then produced M. Butterfly. Eiko Ishioka designed M. Butterfly, the original production. Philip Glass and I have now written 5 operas. Actually, our 5th opera just opened last week in Sweden. So in that respect, it ended up being something that fell apart, but left seeds that grew into other things.
You know, listening to you say it that way, it is the interesting thing. I have a low battery. It's the interesting part of defining what falling apart means, because what you just described is about one project that fell apart, but actually just created all of these relationships that were going to make other projects. So in a sense, I think we see falling apart as failures, but as I age, I'm seeing that some things are necessarily, they have to almost break apart so that other things happen, because not always about the work. It's always about the relationships that you make forming the work. And that is for me, I guess a healthier way of seeing those of events that because there's some works that just don't catch on, either the time or you don't get the rights or something, but you can't unmeet people. And I guess for me, it would be David Gordon and Aine Gordon, and I did a piece on the early 20th century silent movie directors. The astonishing group, starting with Carl Laemmle and all the way on down. And it was the most worthy idea. And I'm hoping that I hope that David still will do it. This is what I learned on that piece, though. It was an unconventional piece that was not supposed to be classically told. And when I saw it, and the Pickup Production Company, I think that's what their company is called. When I saw it, it was so them. And the more that we worked on it, the more it felt like we were making a pie and just taking that dough and kneading it. You know, the beauty of pie dough is that you have to keep it really cold and you can't touch it a lot. because if you touch it too much, you make it tough. And if you manipulate it too much, it gets tougher and tougher because the strands strengthen. And some works are like that. And this work was like that. And when we tried to make it sort of conventional, we didn't honor the thing that it was telling us it wanted to be. And it was so painful to watch it. The more we worked on it, the worse it got. And I've learned so much from that sort of visceral feeling about like, wait a minute, this baby needs braces, not swimming lessons. This kid doesn't want to swim. This kid wants to do this, because those shows are like that. And it just, but that subject haunts me to this day.
David, you were a mentor for TDF's Wendy Wasserstein project. And Jeanine, you're a co-founder of a Broader Way Foundation. Why is theater education important to you? I went first last time.
Okay. That's true. This is, for me, everything. You and I are deeply invested in education and mentorship and sponsorship. It's certainly, you know, I've always loved the story that you tell about Joe Papp, because it's not an uncomplicated story, double negative. And for me, this idea of making sure that the golden rule for me is, in high tides, all boats should rise. If people are doing well, everybody should be doing well. Maybe it's not by the same degrees because we're still in a capitalist system, but everybody should be doing well. Everyone. If the top is doing well, the bottom should be doing well. And so this idea that there are secret rooms inside theater, that was certainly true when I moved to the city when I was 17, not expecting to go into music. And there seemed to be doors and cabinets that people could open. And I was not one of them for a very, very long time. And I remember that feeling, and I still often have that feeling. And that's when I'm feeling like I don't have the keys to some secret something. And that is not a feeling I enjoy. And I don't think that it's useful. I really feel like the further anyone goes, that there's the moral imperative is to make sure that everyone else has access because you have greater access. And that's necessary. And if you're not doing that, I think that is wrong. That's, to me, leadership has those kinds of responsibilities. If you start doing well, whatever well means, I think that it's really important to share your knowledge, to not power hoard, to not intellectual property hoard, to not hoard your wealth. I just think that to me is the foundation. That's truly being a patriot in this country. And I really resent when the right seem to co-opt that idea that one is a patriot, because this is what I learned from you foremost, David. It absolutely clarified the vision that the greatest freedom is when you have a collective. It's not about self, that there's a collective freedom. And if you're not working towards it, you're working against it. So that's why I feel like it's really important. And that I definitely felt like I was a student learning from you.
Oh, thank you. So I knew Wendy Wasserstein, and we were, I can't say I was as close to her as some people, but I think we were friends and we were supporters of each other. And I agree with you, Jeanine, that, you know, writers, I think particularly, and, you know, composers, playwrights, I think we're relatively generous to each other. Mm-hmm. Compared to, like, maybe directors sometimes seem not so generous to each other. But because I think that when we write in our own voices, we know that we can only do what we can do. We can't do what the other, you know, what another writer is doing. Like I'm at, you know, Columbia with Lynn Nottage and Chuck Mee, and they're both amazing writers, and I can't write like that. So I feel like part of this job of being a playwright is to pass on what you know. It's sort of like being a cobbler. You know, you should, like, it. Yes, the way you write a play is there's some technical differences maybe now than 300 or 400 or 500 years ago, but essentially it's not that different. So I think we have collective knowledge that we need to pass on. In terms of the Wendy project, it's not necessarily about taking students from New York City public high schools to plays that they are necessarily going to become theater artists, but some of them may, and some of them are interested in it, and others, it's about the theater being part of the legacy and part of the birthright of all students. And so those are really important values, and values that I believe in, that Wendy cared enough about to start this program. And I am really happy to get to move that along.
Oh gosh. What is the first show you want to see when Broadway reopens? Soft Power.
Yes. Great. Easy answer.
Boom. I believe that's our show, ladies and gentlemen. TDF. That's no. You go, David.
No, I'm just going to take your answer.
Okay, good.
We don't always have to have a different answer.
Okay.
Have you been staying creative during the pandemic? I mean, for me, writers are, relatively lucky in the pandemic because we're used to like just doing something in our room all by ourselves anyway. Of course, if you're a script writer, you're a theater writer, then there's a part that's lonely, and then there's a part where you kind of have a party with other people, and our respective and collective parties have not been happening. But I feel like I've gotten a lot of work done during the pandemic.
Oh, do you, David? Well, I'm so happy for you.
Sorry. How's it going for you?
I was able to work. It took me, I will say, it took me a while to quiet the voices of panic. I think I think what was happening in New York, especially, my daughter was a senior in college, and on March 11th, I called her and said, "You have to come home tomorrow morning." And that was that. And then Broadway shut down, and then people started dying. And then there was a hospital in Central Park, and then there was a hospital, and there was a hospital, and then there were trucks, and there were helicopters, and there was, I think those ideas, it was very hard to, and I agree with you, David. I feel like I'm in a way, as a writer, we're pandemic ready because we're used to isolating. And then there's another part where we're let out of our, zoo cages, and you go, and other people, you're allowed to be with other people. But on this quieting, the information going in and out of my brain, I found very hard to do. So it took me a long time. I eventually got to work. I do think that, and you and I have talked about this, there was a lot of social activism that had to happen at a different rate than certainly I've always been involved in it, but it was at a different rate and with a different kind of call, because there were things that had to be suddenly applied in a way. The substantive change has a tempo to it, and this was a preparation for a time where there was a pause, and then that pause was going to end. So I think that was different. And but then I finally worked out how to, I had to be very careful with news feeds. Once I stopped that, the essential information always reached me, and making sure that my family, my mom, like everybody, there were a lot of people, we lost a lot of people. And when I was able to quiet that down, I was able to locate and actually use what I had been feeling a lot of that time and put it into the work. And this piece that I'm writing called Grounded is about a female pilot. and the sort of the freedom of being up in the air and the terror of being up in the air, that was not very hard after a little while to evoke, but it took a long time to get there.
Yeah, well, you know that I'm sufficiently compartmentalized as a human being that the only place that I can figure out how I feel about this is through the work. So that's maybe why I got some work done.
That's very good though, when one wants to. I really like getting to a part of a score when you can weigh something. Well, that's what I really like, that part. Last question. What lessons do you hope the theater industry learns from the shutdown? Oh, holy moly. Maybe you and I can like popcorn this one back and forth.
Gosh. I mean, there's so many.
Where do we start?
So there's, I've been doing this long enough that I know that the way that we did theater in 2020 is not how it has to be. That so many of the forms that we had that have been invented about how theater is made, things like the regional theater, things like Broadway becoming this huge moneymaker, but then because you could make so much money, it became more like Vegas by the time you get to 2020. It doesn't have to be that way. So that's the sort of overall category. And then, yeah, there's fundamentally, it is about making theater a part of everybody's life, that everybody feels invited to the theater and everybody feels welcome because we reach out to people and we make theater part of their communities and we welcome them in, and we tell all sorts of stories. I don't know.
That's beautiful. There are many, many things that I think, but maybe I'm going to boil it down in this answer to two things: curiosity and distinctions. I think the curiosity is to ask, you and I as theater makers, we're constantly asking ourselves, well, why this, why now, why would they sing, why is it this way, why is it not that way? And I think that's why, at the end of the day, I think, give me a bourbon, and then in the morning give me a coffee, and those are the temples. Because you're the choices that you have to make when you're looking at life and putting it on a stage and organizing it. There are the many, many choices. And then eventually you have to say, no, it's an eighth note and this is in B flat. And you have to say, no, this character says this now. And then they stop talking. And then there are 6 scenes. Oh no, there's 7 scenes. Like those decisions in this giant buffet is really, really hard. I would like that kind of curiosity to be prevalent in all things, in all systems of making theater. Why are the investors paid off first? I understand the risk involved, but I understand the reward. Why is the system this way and not that way? Why don't we audition musicians for 802? Why do we simply keep casting people that we know because it's the inner circle? Why do we do this kind of tech where people are exhausted and usually get hurt, and not this kind of tech? I understand the money part. Why is a ticket $150? Why is this ticket $300? All of those things. Why are the measured numbers of the AAPI community so low? Okay, then how? And really, that's what we do. Is I think we have, as generative artists, we have a lot that a methodology that we can look like and not just accept. The thing I cannot stand when you first start writing musical theater and people say, well, this is where the I Want song goes. And, my garage door just closes, because I think I know that as a formula. And I know that because you bring someone onto the stage to watch them work out the conflict. I get all that. But to say that is to not understand that the form should be dictated to me by the content, the path of the character. So I think it's that kind of radical curiosity. And the other thing, the distinctions, which I hope involve nuance. So we're talking about safety in rehearsals. Well, discomfort is safe, and also very, very subjective. But the way that you work to our growing edge is to ask your students, yourself, your audience, even in entertaining, to be uncomfortable a lot. And that is not a form of anything punitive. That's how you grow. You go through a process that you go through a metamorphosis that involves a kind of struggle and pushing through a kind of hardship. And I hope that we make this distinction, that we're constantly looking at our resilience inside being a student, being a maker of work, of something that is not based on something punitive. Because God knows, David, when you and I entered this business, the the process was filled with people throwing chairs at us,
Mhm.
and people calling us names. Like, for me, it was about being called, like, you know, a whore, and basically I was working for 50 an hour, like a whore would make. And that those kinds of things, that's not helpful. But to be asked to push ourselves to say, this is uncomfortable, that means that you are growing if you work through that fear. That is a distinction that often requires missteps and then corrections. And I hope that we go along that path. That's my real hope.
Yeah, that's beautifully stated. And I think it's important to say, the field has to be made uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
we as artists experience discomfort in order to create something, but the field, in order to grow, has to be willing to be uncomfortable as well.
Yeah. Right. Like, right on. Right on. Thank you.
You.
TDF.
Thanks, TDF. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Jeanine. I missed you. When are we gonna? Well, actually, we have an idea of when we might be in a room together again.
Yes, we do. And DHH, thank you for the invitation to the party, because you have. I say this to you, but it's nice to say it in front of the TDF audience. Without this show, there would have been a part of me that would have remained really blind to many, many things. And so this is a complete gift working with you.
Well, without you, the show wouldn't have had heart. So thank you.
Okay, I'll take it. Thanks, TDF.